Hey everyone. Today we're hoping to tie off RBAC and finish our conversation. The last conversation that we want to have today is around what I would call composite roles. This isn't an official term, but it describes the state that you need to be aware of when you're creating and administering role-based access controls in Microsoft Intune. Now, remember, let's start at the beginning. Role-based access controls are what you can do, what you can see, and what you can impact, right? So what you can do, those are the permissions that you define in Microsoft Intune. These would be things like device configuration, create, read, update, delete, assign. Same thing for managed apps, same thing for managed devices, so on and so forth. What you can see, those are scopes, scope tags, right? Scope tags specifically, I guess. And scope tags control what you can see in the console and are able to take action on. And then what you can impact, those are most commonly referred to as scope groups, right? When you define an object or deploy an object, define and then deploy an object to a set of Azure AD groups, you're delegated a set of groups to have access to deploy to. And then your behavior can change for your policies depending on who they're deployed to, right? So like for instance, if I was to create a policy and deploy it to Azure AD Group A, somebody was to come along and deploy that same policy to Azure AD Group B, and I didn't have the scope to Azure AD Group B, I'd no longer be able to make changes to that policy. So remember that it's important to make sure that there's clear lines of delegation and you remove deduplication from your policies as well. Like you don't want to have 15 policies that all do the same thing. You should think through ways that your organization can work together within the RBAC constraints that you've defined for your organization. Now, the other thing that to consider is when you create multiple RBAC roles or multiple role-based access control roles or permissions or deployments or assignments, you should really think about how those things work together. In Microsoft Intune, it's important to note that we sort of do some composite of those roles when a user logs into the console. So you can be assigned more than one role in Microsoft Intune to grant you granular access, however you need to for your organization, right? However you decide to define it. This can be particularly troublesome sometimes, though, when you create maybe an RBAC role that has certain scopes, and then you grant different permissions or you assign different permissions with yet other scopes. You should be aware that when you create these assignments, you're delegating the permissions, number one, that are included in the assignments, and you're also delegating the scope tags. Now, you should know that there are instances where you will have control over assets that you have been assigned other scope tags for. So like, for instance, if I was to create a scope A, and a set of permissions, a group of permissions A, and assign that to a user, and then I was to create a group of permissions, let's just call it permissions B, and assign it to scope B, that user has access to scope A and B, and they also have access to the permissions in A and B. Now, it may sound a little abstract or confusing, but it's important to make sure that you fully test your role-based access control deployments before you start rolling them out widely. You should understand how those different assignments and different deployments work together. You should mix those roles together to understand, in your environment, how is this going to work if a user is assigned more than one role? Is it going to inadvertently give them more permission, less permission, etc.? It's really important to know these permutations, and if there's any that you don't want to happen, you should build this into your targeting scheme. Doing things like excluding users from being in more than one group, or taking measures to make sure that a user can't be assigned both groups or both sets of permissions or scopes, etc. The other option that you have is you might need to more granularly define your permissions and your scopes. You may need to break them down further to make sure that the end user, or in this case, the IT admin that you're delegating, has the right level of permissions in the console and does not have more permissions than they need to do their job. So often we see misconfigurations and expanded roles in management consoles like Microsoft Intune or other consoles that you use to manage your environment, playing a role in effectively expanding the attack surface of your environment. It's important to make sure that you know the blast radius, you know the control, the scopes that you're delegating in your environment, and you make sure that everybody operates with the least amount of permissions possible to remain productive in their job. Remember that Microsoft Intune has the flexibility that you need to deploy these roles and scopes, and you should really sit down and think through an architecture before starting to deploy and manage role-based access control in your environment. And this doesn't go just for Intune. I mean, I know we've spent a lot of time talking about Intune-specific concepts and implementations, but whenever you're asked to delegate and design roles for your environment, for any product, you should sit down and you should think through what certain pieces and what certain controls and different pieces that those folks in your enterprise actually need access to. Defaulting first to read and then expanding to write and update and delete as necessary, the more detrimental functions. So that'll be our wrap up on RBAC. I appreciate you all sticking with me through the first couple episodes here. Next time we'll dive into a different topic. I have a couple top of mind. We'll see which one comes out. But as always, have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you all soon. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.